sleep, go to 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 sleep. Avengers Age of Ultron is the video that I've actually been waiting to do the most. For some reason, I feel like this entire look back series, I feel like this is the one that I was just like building to. Like when we get to this, I have so many things to say because Age of Ultron is such a loaded movie and it remains to date one of the more dividing movies for a lot of people who like the MCU. This was a divisive movie even at the time. I remember when it was coming out, the hype around it was significant. I mean, obviously after the first Avengers, there was so much interest in where the series was going to go. And then especially after 2014, when you had the Winter Soldier and Guardians of the Galaxy, it was like, oh my god, the quality has exponentially increased. And so at that point of time, Age of Ultron could only match up to that, right? Even the trailers that were dropping with it were incredibly eerie, with Ultron talking about having no more strings on him, the more creepy rendition of There Are No Strings on Me from, Pinocchio being played in the background. And there were aspects of that were definitely very, very interesting. Having James Spader as Ultron as well created a lot of interest. The movie came out then in May 2015, or April actually for me, because I saw it in the last week of April. This is one of those MCU movies that I actually got to see a little bit early due to just the location where I happened to be, because this was released early in a couple of places. And I got to see it with a packed crowd. It was a Saturday night. And I remember watching it, and at the time, I remember really enjoying Age of Ultron, although I think I share the universal opinion that most people have, which is it's not as good as the first Avengers movie. It's also not as good as the two movies that preceded it, Winter Soldier and Guardians 1. So at the end of the day, it might not be one of the best Marvel movies, but in retrospect, it is one of the more important ones. It set up the entire slate pretty much going forward. All the major events that take place in Phase 3 after this are in this movie. You see the first hints of all of that. Whether it's the feud between the members of the Avengers leading into Civil War, Thor's visions that lead into Ragnarok, and also Infinity War and Endgame. There's so much stuff going on when it comes to those characters, and there's even more things I haven't even mentioned yet. I mean, Hulk in the end of the movie, eventually that leads into Thor Ragnarok. And so with all of that in mind, Age of Ultron had a lot of heavy lifting to do. This was a very definitive movie in a lot of ways for the MCU. The fact that a lot of those payoffs have happened the way that they have is credit to the fact that, this movie did do a good job eventually with those setups. That being said, even while watching it as an individual experience, it can feel incredibly stuffy. There is so much crammed in here, and there are so many things that it wants to do, that even the main Ultron plot sometimes can go sideways as a result and lose some focus. When it does focus on some of the stuff with Ultron, though, it's incredibly interesting, and I think casting James Spader was kind of a genius decision, because he is excellent in this performance. He does the motion capture as well as the voice work, of course. And even though Ultron as a villain, sometimes I feel like his motivation could be a little more unique, especially when it starts off unique and it becomes, sort of like a I want to destroy everything, I'm the evil bad guy sort of thing. Even in those moments, I think Spader really manages to sell Ultron's motivations very, very well. Something I want to show you actually is that, because people usually collect bobbleheads, I've learned over, in my time, my first ever bobblehead was Ultron, and it was from that Hot Toys thing. That's Ultron. One thing that does stick, however, when it comes to this movie, and having just rewatched it last night, that's something that I found even now, is once again the team dynamic. They have done a great job with these characters, and from the first movie to now, once again, all these characters are incredibly well realized. When it comes to Tony Stark, Steve Rogers, Natasha Romanoff, Bruce Banner, Thor, Hawkeye, Clint Barton. Once again, all of them are able to work off of each other very, very nicely, and some of the stuff that's going on with each character was very good. Some stuff is polarizing though, especially when it comes to Bruce and Natasha. There is an aspect of this movie that leads into them having a thing for each other. This doesn't go anywhere in the future of the MCU, but it's also something that's kind of awkward in this movie. Conceptually, the idea they introduce is that Natasha sees him as this pacifist in the middle of all the action. It's like, I've only known war and violence, and so to have someone who could, be the ultimate weapon, want to, just get away and have a quiet life, something about that is endearing. And I guess they find some common ground in that of sorts, but it's not very well executed. It feels very weirdly tacked on, especially because it doesn't really lead to anything. And so it just turns out to be this kind of a mistake. It's like there's about 10-15 minutes of movie that you could just avoid if you didn't do it with that specific angle. And if you tried it with a different thing going on with these characters, something like what Steve and Natasha had in The Winter Soldier, like that kind of a dynamic maybe. But regardless of that aspect, the rest of the stuff is pretty solid. It's once again just building on the fears that Tony now has thanks to all of the events that happened in the first Avengers, but also what he has been shown thanks to the Scarlet Witch. This movie really does bring the twins into the foray with Wanda and Pietro Maximoff, played by Elizabeth Olsen and Aaron Taylor Johnson. I thought Elizabeth Olsen was really good here. I mean, you get a really good representation of the Scarlet Witch, and she's quite terrifying in this movie, especially with the visions that she's imbuing into every single character, bringing out their worst fears and their nightmares. Especially when it comes to Tony, he sees the death of the entire team on his hands, and he is trying to prevent that from happening, which leads him to want to create Ultron so that there could be this bigger force when something horrible was going to come through, from space in order to, take over the Earth once again and destroy the world. And so those aspects of it definitely haunt him, and that's something that, again, the film realizes nicely. But then when it comes to Thor, him seeing the end of Asgard and seeing all of his, friends and family going to hell, that aspect leading into Thor Ragnarok, and then also seeing the collection of the Infinity Stones happening over, the last few years and the last few movies as we've seen, and something nefarious happening on the sides, which might relate to that at some point, is also something that, you understand those fears. They come through very well. Steve's, I would say, is the one that ends up being the most poignant because he wants the life that he never had, that being a happy, lovely life with Peggy. And you get a little hint of that because it's like, we can go home. And something about that is resonating for the rest of his arc, even as the movies progress. That's something that does play on his mind, and the movie plays that well here. And with Black Widow, just seeing Natasha's past, seeing her in the Red Room, and seeing the agent that she's eventually becoming, it's eventually addressed when you get to her movie, which is much later. That's in Phase 4 of the MCU, but again, there was some compelling stuff over there. My favorite aspect of the movie, though, when I really think about it, is Hawkeye. I always really liked the sequence where you just are at his ranch for a bit. That entire moment where it's just downtime with the characters, having conversations with each other, and, just having a quiet moment over there. That was one of my favorite aspects. And it kind of harkened back to the first movie in that sense, because in the first movie, my favorite moments were those, quick character moments in the back and forth. And so to have an entire sequence like that, like when Clint is talking to Laura, played by Linda Cardellini, it's just this very sweet moment between husband and wife, and they captured that very nicely. The one character I haven't talked about so far is Vision, played by Paul Bettany. He was the voice of Jarvis, but then when he's apparently assimilated by Ultron in that AI mode, and then eventually the dump file is found as he's been countering Ultron, trying to get the nuclear launch codes. That entire aspect of it I thought was interesting, but then eventually leading into the birth of Vision, which was supposed to be Ultron's final form. That aspect of it was very compelling, and I really liked Vision in this movie. That introduction to him as someone who is looking at it from all sorts of angles and, measuring all the variables, and then eventually being the one worthy enough to pick up the hammer after Thor. And it's this big shock moment because at the time, no one else could lift Mjolnir. Like Odin, yes, and Thor, of course, but that's it. No one else had laid a finger on Mjolnir yet and made any movement. There was a tiny little bit from Steve at the party, which eventually that has a payoff. But then Vision just effortlessly picking it up. I remember there was this gasp from the audience, like, oh my god. And then there was a bit of a clap as well because no one could really just believe what happened. But they handled that very surprisingly effectively. It was a very good shock moment. But also just the idea that, taking on Ultron is the ideologies are so different because there are aspects of him where you understand where he's coming from, but that his actions have devastating consequences. And so to measure out those variables was also very, very good. The action is very fun. It's very fast paced. There's some really cool stuff going on. The standout sequence, I'm sure many will tell you, is the Hulkbuster sequence where he has to fight, Hulk on the streets of Johannesburg. That entire sequence is brutal. It's visually incredible and it's very, very tense. Like they did a fantastic job with that sequence. It's very similar to Iron Man 2 in that sense though, because it's also like that, in that movie, the best sequence happens in like the early part of the movie where the Grand Prix sequence is going on. So it's very similar to that. It's like the finale is similar in that there's also a lot of faceless drones or robots in this case where, they all have to just take them on while standing in a circle. But even though that finale is fun, the better sequence is the one that happens before that. It's just something that I wanted to make note of. But there are aspects to it, like I said, when it comes to the storytelling that do feel very rushed as a result. There are so many things happening that it does sort of buckle under its own weight pretty often. Like I said, I like the stuff with Ultron and I like the stuff with some of the Avengers, but then because it's trying to do too much, it does tend to lose focus pretty often, and that's something that is incredibly disappointing. It also feels like a lot of other things were done very, very quickly when it came to Age of Ultron, because even some of the other technical aspects that were better in the first movie are a bit off over here. Even the score by Brian Tyler and also with Danny Elfman, some stuff is nice, but it is a very sizable drop in quality from the Avengers and even Iron Man 3 with Brian Tyler and Thor: The Dark World. Compared to those coming into this, the score is not as memorable. In fact, it's my least favorite of the 4 scores. The finale goes crazy, especially with Sokovia being lifted into the sky, and eventually if it reaches enough altitude, it will come down like a meteor and wipe out the planet because it's like made of vibranium, like indestructible stuff. But it's just, it's such a crazy moment. Like when the city started to lift, I remember I was sitting in the theater and I was thinking, how is this going to play out? Like how do you make this finale happen? And then when it started that happening and, you hear Friday, the new AI in Tony's helmet go,
Sokovia's going for a ride.
Like immediately it just hits you like, oh, this is tense. Like how do you get out of this situation? And then taking on hundreds of Ultron drones while they're all flying around trying to take out people. This mass evacuation order that was originally supposed to be in place going to hell. And so all the people are at risk now. Very, very tense stuff. And I really like that third act aspect of this. Pietro Maximoff, though, as he's been running around the entire time, him eventually making the sacrifice play of this movie and saving Hawkeye from being shot down by Ultron in the Quinjet. And that moment was tragic, although I don't feel like one of the things that was there with him is like I would have liked a little bit more with Quicksilver to have that moment hit a bit more. What really works in that moment is Wanda's reaction. It's this wave that she unleashes, wiping out several drones and disintegrating them at once, these Ultron bots. And when that happens, it was like, yeah, you could feel the pain come through. And once again, Olsen in this movie, really, really good as Scarlet Witch. She's proven in the time since then, even with, other Avengers movies, and then of course with WandaVision, that she is excellent as this character. The final bit that I keep going back to in Age of Ultron is the final scene, right as Ultron is, about to get killed. That moment between Vision and Ultron, as they're talking to each other, then it's again, this is something where it's like, it's so well done. It has my favorite line as well from the entire movie.
But a thing isn't beautiful because it lasts. It's a privilege to be among them.
I find Age of Ultron to be an interesting one when I think about it, because I know so many people who don't really like this movie. And for good reason. There are a lot of things about it that are vastly inferior to the first Avengers movie, and even to other Marvel movies that existed in the MCU at this point. There are many mistakes it makes. But at the same time, it is incredibly fascinating to go back to, and there is some stuff over here that is genuinely interesting. The action, like I said, is very good. Ultron, I really like. I like the cast once again, all the characters. You know, the finale is a lot of fun. That Hulkbuster sequence was very, very well done. And there are things to enjoy over there. There's some funny moments with the humor too. Like I mentioned, that sequence where they're trying to lift up the hammer over and over again is funny. The running joke with Cap yelling language at Tony because he says shit, and then eventually every time someone says anything bad in front of Steve, it's like, hey, he minds that language, you know, did he hear that? That character said a bad language word. All of that is very, very entertaining, and so those aspects were nicely handled. I just think it's very stuffy at times, and there's too much that it's trying to do, and that prevents it from reaching, you know, true greatness. Leading to that final bit of the movie, that final mid-credit scene where you get Thanos putting on the Infinity Gauntlet and saying he's gonna do it himself now. I've been talking this entire time, and it's right over there. So guys, thank you very much for watching. This went a little longer than I thought it would, but like I said, had a lot to say about it. Let me know what you guys think of Age of Ultron. I'm very curious to always hear thoughts on this movie. There are just so many things that revolve around it, so I'm curious to hear what you'll have to say. As always, if you like this, please do subscribe. Thank you very much once again for watching, and thank you for enjoying these videos. We're at the end game now of this series. The next one is Ant-Man, and that's the end of that. I have had so much fun with these, and I can't wait to talk to you about that movie. Thank you very much once again, and as always, I will see you guys at the movies.